Streffeld Hall, and distinguished friends and colleagues, allow me first to really again welcome you to the Africa House and express my appreciation for the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries, Permanent Mission of South Africa, and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect for convening this discussion. The theme, safeguarding human rights from military and security enterprises operating at proxies, speaks directly to challenges confronting communities across our continent. The African Union engagement with this issue is formed by its lived experience. Across Africa, communities have witnessed how mercenaries, actors, and the private military companies operating outside established legal frameworks fundamentally undermine human rights protections. These entities often act beyond the reach of international humanitarian law, evading accountability mechanisms while committing violations that cause profound harm to civilian populations. The African Union, we have our normative framework in this, rooted, adopted 1977 OAU Convention for the Elimination of Mercenaries in Africa. 1977 is too much way back, which explicitly in Article 1 characterizes these activities as a crime against peace and security in Africa. Recognizes them precisely because of their inherent threat to human dignity. It is worth recalling that Article 7 of our convention establishes that mercenaries shall not enjoy the status of combatants and shall not be entitled to the prisoners of war status. This provision underscores a fundamental principle. These actors cannot claim the protections afforded to lawful combatants while simultaneously evading obligations under international humanitarian law. They operate in a legal void of their own, making yet it is civilian populations who bear the consequences. The Convention's comprehensive approach, criminalizing recruitment, training, and financing of mercenary activities, reflects our collective understanding that such operations systematically undermine fundamental rights and freedoms. And this challenge is compounded by the transnational nature of modern mercenary entities. Victims face unique obstacles to remedy and reparation as a complex corporate structures and judicial gaps create impunity. Furthermore, the intersection between mercenary activities and illicit weapons flows directly threatens fundamental rights to life, security, and development. Small arms proliferation through mercenary networks account for the majority of civilian casualties, undermining peace and stability essential for human rights realization. Dear friends, the AU Peace and Security Council in its 11th 189th meeting in the 1st December 2023, the communique which came out of that meeting calls for the expedited finalization of the convention's review, and it reflects underscores our collective recognition that evolving security dynamics require equal, adaptive, and robust responses. Context, we advocate for strengthened international cooperation through the establishment of mandatory human rights due diligence, the application of universal jurisdiction for grave violations, and the enhancement of mechanisms to ensure comprehensive protection of victims. Conclude, the path forward requires collective commitment and shared responsibility. Safeguarding human rights from these unregulated actors demands comprehensive framework, robust accountability, and unwavering dedication to protecting civilian populations. The African Union stands ready to work with all partners toward these essential objectives. Thank you very much, and back to you, my dear brother.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Idris, and also for those words and highlighting the commitment of the African Union and its member states to this issue. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, and the way that the African Union is grappling and dealing with this, but also with the support of the international. But if I can allow now to pass over to you, Giovanna, and we're in your hands. So all of the best for the presentations.
Thank you, ambassadors, both of you. Thank you, African Union, for today welcoming us such a pleasant way and having this discussion here in House of Africa, and thinking about the issues that are also going and relevant to the continent. And also, thank you with us and supporting the event. For a special thank you ability to protect for joining us. I think it's very important that we are having also this discussion here, because African Union, one of in regulating, probably the only entity officially doing so, and especially in the context that we are looking today of renewal of commitments to conventionals, redrafted and reconsidered elements, particularly they also. I want to welcome the people who are, especially my colleagues, translation, their forefront, especially being widely spoken. Unfortunately, might be aware that you got, especially as a special rapporteur. So apologize for not having. Thank you for everybody else who joined from parts of the world. The speakers that will be joining with me, the Jocelyn Strength Hall from Global Center, who is sitting with me, but we have two speakers effectively. Cool. I didn't want to speak much today because I think report speaks itself. We presented it yesterday to the third committee assembly. The report is on proxies, enablers and facilitators, both state and non-state actors who are using private military security companies, mercenary and mercenary-related actors. And we are quite aware this is a wide scope of actors that we are putting together today to address, and they're very different between each other, but they do all contribute to this continuum of violence that is being prolonged and fuels the conflict globally. In that sense, I wanted to just highlight two different aspects, mainly or two different actors that we are seeing contributing to the proxy as a proxy actors in the conflict, and mostly just to give a bit of introduction, I guess, to what is going to come from later on with examples from my colleagues, analysts. So when we are addressing the terms and role of the states, when we are addressing the states and the role that they have in these as a proxy actors, enablers or facilitators, we are talking about different kind of states and their roles. They can be the host states, they can be the third states, or they can be just the contracting states for private military and security companies. When we are talking about mercenary-related actors, they're usually foreign nationals that are engaged. And the states are usually using mercenaries, mercenary-related actors, and private military and security companies as a conduits for and/or hubs for their activities and operations. And how this actually plays out, we see this from transshipments, for example, use of airports of certain states, ports, cargoes, and bases for transport of material that these actors are using. We see them in logistical support through assets and equipment support, such as planes, tanks, refineries, and advanced communication systems. We see them as facilitators of provision of intelligence, information, and personnel, trafficking hubs for illicit resources and arms that fund the activities of mercenaries, mercenary-related actors, and companies, providing a site and passage for the recruiting and personnel for mercenaries, mercenary-related actors, and private military and security companies. Training and engaging of local non-state actors, such as militias, insurgents, rebels, and foreign fighters, to carry out the attacks or engage in fighting on their behalf. And private military and security companies are also used to combat crime and robbery. Non-state actors are also can be very broad when we are relating to them and their role and what kind of participant leaders here in this report. And some of them are commercial entities, other ones state actors, but they might include bankers, they might include owners of cryptocurrencies, iron licenses and licensed crypto exchanges, legal firms and lawyers, accountants, customs officials, recruitment and labor agents, front companies, certification bodies, even influencers are very much used for discrimination for and gaining the ground trust of or later on recruit. I would stop here and leave space more for because the event is so short. I would like to remind the people who are online just to use the chat for the questions as the event goes. At the end, we have a few minutes. And then our colleague will collect the questions and play it to us. But at this moment, I would like to welcome the Jocelyn Stateful Hall. She's a Deputy Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility for the Protect, where she has been an expert on responsibility to protect and atrocity preventions for the last 15 years. During her time at the Global Center, Jocelyn has led the development of quarterly and weekly publications assessing the risk of mass atrocities in countries around the world and has facilitated the center's work on peace building and civilian protection, human peace and security, and the other programmatic areas. She will be addressing the human rights aspects. And thank you for joining us. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivana. Thank you to the Ambassador and the African Union for providing this beautiful space today, and to our co-hosts, the Working Group on Use of Mercenaries and South Africa, for helping to organize this event. And thank you everyone who's here in the room and online today. My organization, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, advocates for the prevention of and response to genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing in country contexts around the world. In the 16 years since we started publicly reporting on country situations, we have witnessed a rise in the use of mercenaries in situations where populations face atrocities. In these contexts, mercenaries and private military and security companies sometimes serve as enablers of atrocities, as precursors and warning signs of atrocities, and are also implicated in war crimes and crimes against humanity themselves. To be clear, the use of proxy actors in atrocity situations is not an aberration, isolated to a few selected cases. Of the 24 crises the Global Center is currently monitoring, at least half have featured the documented use of mercenaries and private military and security companies to target civilians. As their use in atrocity situations continues to grow, so too does evidence of their own crimes and their enduring impact on societies. Proxy actors are utilized or enabled by a wide range of actors in crises. Both state and non-state actors have worked with mercenaries. In Libya, for example, private military and security companies are used both by the UN-backed government of national unity and Khalifa Haftar's opposition Libyan Arab armed forces. We also witnessed third-party states, including Russia, the United Arab Emirates, among others, leveraging a variety of proxies to carry out abuses in other countries. While there's much we can focus on with the relationship between mercenaries and atrocities, in the interest of time for this event, I'll highlight 3 different dimensions of this linkage today. How they enable and perpetuate conditions for atrocity risks, evidence of atrocity crimes directly committed by mercenaries, and how their presence confounds accountability for abuses in various conflicts. First, the use and presence of mercenaries is a warning sign for atrocity crimes and the legacy of their use in enabling further abuses. Although the UN Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes does not directly invoke mercenaries, private military and security companies, or proxy forces, aspects of their presence within countries still resonate with the UN structure of risk factors. Notably, through the capacity to commit atrocities and the creation of what the UN has called enabling circumstances for atrocities. The functional role of these entities, which includes providing tactical support, intelligence, aerial assets, and other services, effectively expands the state's military capacity through proxy means or the capacity of armed forces, non-state armed forces. Their presence expands the availability of personnel, of arms, and ammunition for committing atrocities and coincides with an influx of external financing for expanding these resources further. And their existence in a conflict sometimes signals the armed, financial, logistic, training, or other support of external actors and third-party states. While in some contexts, the use of mercenaries is done under the auspices of improving security through combating armed extremism and fighting back armed groups, the reliance on mercenaries has typically not improved security. Rather, it has fueled local grievances, communal violence, and recruitment by armed groups, all of which are warning signs of an imminent risk of atrocity crimes. In both Mali and Central African Republic, the presence of mercenaries has coincided with the targeting of ethnic and religious minorities. This has prolonged the conflicts by escalating tensions and rights abuses, blocked political solutions, and obstructed the conditions needed for safe return of displaced civilians. In places like Libya and the Sahel, where the use of proxies is not exclusively limited to state security operations, the presence of mercenaries has also strengthened warlord and militia governance structures, which has enduring legacies beyond periods of conflict. Sudan, mercenaries supported by Russian, Emirati, Central African, and Libyan actors have supplied the RSF with missiles, weapons, and soldiers. Mercenaries and private military and security companies have also provided training, as Giovanna mentioned, to government forces, armed groups, and even proxy forces. These groups' own lack of respect for international human rights and humanitarian law means that government forces are not being trained or professionalized with knowledge of international standards, and then go on to perpetrate abuses that amount to atrocities themselves. The expansion of government capacities through outsourcing core state functions to proxies also signals existing fragility in states, a structural risk factor for atrocities. The involvement of such actors in fragile states tends to exacerbate governance failures rather than ameliorate them. Reliance on proxies further weakens oversight mechanisms and undermines the rule of law. Over the years, the Wagner Group has been implicated in disinformation campaigns and election interference in the Central African Republic, which are also both factors that could trigger atrocities. One final aspect of warning signs I want to highlight is how mercenaries are embedding themselves in war economies and facilitating further resource extraction and scarcity. This creates long-term civilian protection risks that outlive active fighting. In some places, like CAR and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they receive concessions or payment in natural resources. In CAR, the deployment of mercenary forces coincided with lucrative mining and logging concessions granted to Russian-linked companies. The UN, human rights organizations, and investigative journalists have extensively documented mercenaries operating alongside the CAR armed forces in campaigns that target civilians in areas specifically where valuable mineral resources are located. Similarly, in the DRC, the interconnection of private military companies with extractives, military operations, and financing creates multiple abuse pathways. Contract signed in December 2024 between the DRC government and Eric Prince for the training and deployment of ground troops, operation of air assets, including drones, and the establishment of a mining police charged with revenue collection from extractives, has deepened the risk of human rights abuses, including forced displacement, land seizure, illicit taxation, and smuggling, which often accompany extractive industry operations in conflict zones. In terms of the perpetration of atrocities, from CAR to Ukraine, from DRC to Syria and elsewhere, mercenary groups are implicated in mass summary executions, arbitrary detentions, torture during interrogations, forced disappearances, forced displacement of the civilian population, indiscriminate targeting of civilian facilities, in some cases amounting to crimes against humanity or war crimes. These actors have also perpetrated violations of the right to health and increasing attacks on humanitarian actors. In places like Libya and the Sahel, mercenary and proxy forces have also laid landmines and IEDs in civilian areas, while in Yemen, proxy forces from as far away as Colombia have reportedly been hired by external actors to engage in high-profile assassinations. Proxy forces have also forcibly recruited fighters into service, and civil society groups have documented evidence showing that during the conflict in Syria, internally displaced persons and economically precarious populations were forcibly recruited to fight abroad under contracts promising wages and benefits. In Ukraine, we have similarly witnessed coercive use of prisoners as fighters, a violation of both IHL and international human rights law. And finally, the third dimension we need to address is the aftermath of atrocities, how proxy force dynamics confound accountability and exacerbate abuses. Since mercenaries and private military companies frequently operate alongside, in support of, or under the tacit invitation and sometimes direction of state security forces, it blurs the line between state and non-state responsibility and creates significant barriers to accountability. The presence of multiple uniformed and ununiformed actors leaves civilians to face a more complex threat environment where proxy actors may not adhere to the same rules of engagement and enables states to deny or evade responsibility. The situation in Ukraine demonstrates how mercenaries are used to circumvent accountability and legal constraints, including to carry out high-risk operations with deniability for the state sponsor. The involvement of private military companies creates additional risk layers in terms of chain of command ambiguity, blurred lines of state responsibility, and opaque legal and regulatory oversight. UN experts and OHCHR have repeatedly warned that such arrangements obstruct independent investigations into possible international crimes. In CAR, for example, the close connections between various actors, along with the lack of transparency, further jeopardizes chances of any impartial investigation and ensuring accountability for abuses and violations. The deployment of mercenaries in Ukraine has similarly blurred chains of command on the side of Russian forces, complicating documentation, attribution, and prosecution of atrocity crimes. The process is now underway via the ICC and Ukrainian trials. From a policy lens, we have to recognize two key things: that the use of proxies in these contexts is symptomatic of larger structural and proximate issues, ranging from state fragility and capacity issues to the prevalence of other forces that governments cannot manage, to financial incentives of extraction of resources, and the prioritization of militarized solutions to internal pressures. And that their presence is further exacerbating atrocity risks, even after they have departed. Efforts to confront the risks posed by these groups must include an atrocity prevention lens, and not just view them from the perspective of there being criminal financial enterprises or armed entities, or from examining their level of success in fulfilling the security roles they were hired for. Policymakers need to confront the economic and security drivers that enable the continued demand for their services and provide the support necessary to dissuade states and other actors from feeling compelled to bring mercenaries and other proxy forces into their fold. I just want to close today by also highlighting the critical importance of the work that Giovanna does under her mandate with the working group on the use of mercenaries. This essential work contributes to filling loopholes in understanding, documenting, reporting on specific issues of mercenaries in many atrocity and conflict settings, and providing a human rights lens to their impact. A benefit of having a specific mandate like theirs dedicated to mercenaries is that often other investigative mechanisms for specific crises do not have the capacities necessary to specifically zoom in on the role and prevalence of mercenaries. There are also advantages to being able to cross-compare situations where such groups are active, so you understand the patterns of their abuses and what is effective in countering their actions. Understanding the actions of a group like Wagner and CAR is very different from understanding their actions across CAR, Mali, Mozambique, Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere holistically, and enables you to see key trends in who is hiring and funding these mercenaries, how they're doing so, and for what purposes. So very thankful for your work.
Jocelyn, and that was a great summary of how we see impacting populations. I would like to pass right away on our next speaker, Oliver Windridge. He is joining us from the UK. He is a senior advisor at the Century. The Century is an investigative and policy organization that seeks to disable multinational predatory networks that benefit from conflict, repression, and kleptocracy. He's a British lawyer with over 12 years of experience practicing international human rights and international criminal law, including over 7 years serving at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the thank you for, now we have Oliver and then Anna joining. So Oliver, floor is yours. Can you please mention 5 possible so we have?
Yeah, of course. Well, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. If you can't, wave. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, we have only a small amount of time, so let me start. Just a very brief thank you to the hosts for this meeting. And it's good to see so many of you online as well. So like Jovana has already said, the Century looks at the conflict and financing of conflict in particular around the world. Through our work for the last 7 years, we've been investigating mercenaries, PMCs, and their links to conflicts. In particular, we've been doing a lot of work on the operations of the Wagner Group that Jacqueline has already mentioned. And I thought it would be, from a very practical standpoint, to very briefly take everyone through 2 of our most recent reports on the Wagner Group as a way of sort of bringing this to life. So in June 2023, we published a report called Architects of Terror, which was a report looking at the Wagner Group's operations in the Central African Republic, which I'll refer to as CAR. And then in August of this year, 2025, we published a piece called Mercenary Meltdown, which was looking at the same group, the Wagner Group's operations in Mali. While both reports show how the Wagner Group acts as a tool of Russian statecraft in Africa, offering security services, embedding itself in resource economies and spreading propaganda, the 2 reports demonstrate 2 very different results. In Central African Republic, the Wagner Group's blueprint succeeded in capturing the state through terror and patronage. In Mercenary Meltdown, which we look at Mali, a similar strategy, in fact, falters, and it exposed Wagner's limits and how they've left instability behind. I think when we look at them together, both serve as essential examples of how Wagner Group and PMCs more broadly speaking, including its successor, the Africa Corps, will continue to exploit vulnerable states to varying degrees of success, using enablers and proxies where possible. So very briefly speaking, in Architects of Terror, we came up with some very key findings that I wanted to share with you. Having arrived in 2018 under the guise of providing military assistance to President Touadéra, whose government was faced with persistent rebellion and international neglect, what followed was the systematic capture of CAR's military, political, and economic systems. In particular, we found the use of terror as governance. Wagner and Touadéra's allies, proxies, enablers, orchestrated widespread campaigns of killing, torture, and rape to consolidate control that many of us are unfortunately very familiar with. They also set up a parallel army, helping to create a shadow military, allowed them to bypass UN processes and directly recruit militia through proxies and enablers. Something that's already been talked about, but is worth mentioning again, I think, is the aim of Wagner groups on the resource capture of Central African Republic. It probably goes without saying, but the Wagner Group is not a charity. They are in it for profit. And so they were able to secure control over KAR's gold and diamond mines and timber through affiliated companies. Of course, there was also political entrenchment. Todera, in a weakened state, relied on Wagner advisors who blended military dominance with propaganda and surveillance. And the impact of all this was the partnership deepened violence, weakened institutions, and entrenched kleptocracy. If we fast forward to our work on Mali, it tells a different story, but a no less interesting one. Arriving in January 2022 to aid the ruling junta in its counter-terrorism efforts. Unlike in KAR, we found that Wagner's Malian campaign was marked by failures, worsening insecurity and internal chaos. As in KAR, terror as governance was attempted, but orchestrated campaigns of extreme violence did occur, but they were accompanied by significant military failure. Wagner Group's forces failed to defeat the insurgents in northern and central Mali, suffering major defeats where dozens of Wagner fighters were killed. There was also evidence in our reports of a backfiring strategy. Lacking intelligence and air power, Wagner use of indiscriminate violence was, whilst grimly successful in KAR, seems to, according to our findings, actually fuel jihadist recruitment in the north of the country. It's interesting also to note that the fear and division that was an indicator of the KAR regime created fear and distrust within the Malian armed forces and in fact deepened divisions inside the junta. Our report also talks about the resource capture attempts of Wagner in Mali as well. And whilst they again try to follow the same blueprint of using proxies and enablers to control Mali's gold sector, this was very limited with only some brief control over artisanal mining. So in 2025, whilst the Wagner Group declared mission accomplished, it in fact left a worse, more fragile and unstable Mali. So in conclusion, whilst the Wagner Group in both situations that we've looked at in this report seem to be relying on a one-size-all-fits approach, relying on the use of extreme violence through proxies and enablers. In Mali, this failed. It's very interesting that perhaps due to a lack of well-trained members, perhaps because of a very different makeup and the resistance in the north, this foundation of fear and violence failed to really quell militia and in fact set the foundations for its ultimate exit. Its attempts at natural resource exploitation in Mali were limited, unlike in KAR. And I think it's important to see these efforts not as siloed actions, but rather as part of a concerted plan. Tackling the violence of PMCs, proxies and enablers is important, not only for the sake of accountability and upholding international human rights standards, but also because it allows us to look at the latter stages of attack on natural resources and governance as discussed. It's important that we take a proactive, not reactive approach. Century continues to advocate for the use of financial tools of pressure to target the illicit financing of these groups, including the enablers and supporters, wherever they are in the world. Strong national and international standards properly implemented around natural resources and good governance preclude groups like Wagner from exploiting them. As I think the ambassador said in his opening remarks, this is a complex situation that requires a multi-track approach. Our reports urge governments and institutions not only to investigate Wagner crimes on the international criminal standards, but also for the use of financial tools of pressure, including sanctions, AML supervisory, and business advisories in order to try and stem and choke the ongoing financing, not only of Wagner, but other PMCs and militias. given the time that we've got, I think I'll leave my, I'll keep my comments to those and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Last to published, I know they're out, but thank you for the. Now we are passing to Anna Powells. She's joining us from New Zealand, and she's an associate professor with the Center of Defense and Security Studies at the Kunenga Ki Purahura Massey University from the New Zealand. Her research publications and policy engagements focus on Pacific security, New Zealand foreign and defense policy in the Pacific, and the global privatization of security. She previously worked in complex humanitarian emergencies and security sector reform in Asia and the Pacific, including with the United Nations, Norwegian Refugee Council, and International Crisis Group. Thank you, Anna, for staying awake, for waking up very early to join us today. Floor is yours, and please can keep 5 to 7 minutes intervention. We would.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I hope you can hear me okay. The audio hasn't been great. Thank you too for the hosts for convening this incredibly important conversation, and for the opportunity as well to share some reflections on the issues that we see here in Asia and the Pacific. Much of the focus is understandably in other parts of the globe, we've just heard from Oliver with respect to Wagner, but there are also some critical developments taking place in Asia and the Pacific. And in order to sort of locate them, it's important to note that security orders in Asia and the Pacific have long been these complex and diffuse ecosystems of security actors ranging from mercenary networks through to corporate military hybrids and informal security enterprises. And that tension between the formal and the informal is incredibly important when we think about proxies, enablers, and facilitators, because these boundaries are very much blurred between public and private power, between legality and illegality, and military and civil functions. And this is becoming particularly pronounced in contexts where security continues to be contested, where governance is fragile, where resources are exploited, and where security outsourcing has become increasingly normalized as a form of political and economic risk management. So my comments are going to be very brief, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples that we're seeing at the moment. But importantly, the absence of coherent regional regulations means that private security enterprises function largely in accordance with national discretion and rather than shared principles. And this regulatory vacuum across the region has allowed these actors to act very much very much without restraints, and it's critical that we focus on strengthening these areas. The Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific represents a security environment as well in which we're seeing an increasing convergence of the dynamics of privatized security, of transnational organized crime, armed conflict, and geopolitical contestation. And this is creating an increasingly complex web of interdependence between these actors. But there are some critical trends I'm just going to focus on for the purposes of this conversation. And the first is the expanding domains of proxy and enabling operations in the region, and particularly with respect to cyber mercenaries. And this is touched upon in the report, and it's highlighted. The UN Working Group highlight this in the previous report, but this is very much a key trend of what we're seeing. So, for example, early this year, Samoa's National Computer Emergency Response Team identified APT-40, the cyber hacking group, which is a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group, as a serious regional threat, citing malicious cyber operations targeting democratic institutions and critical infrastructure. And in this instance, APT-40 is proxy enabler and facilitator. The same group has been linked to attacks on New Zealand's parliament in 2021 and the 2024 breach of Palau's national treasury where there was sensitive defense and diplomatic documents stolen. And this cyber attack was enormously significant because it resulted in the theft of thousands of documents, including critical security documents with respect to US radar installations in Palau, Japanese naval ship visits, and of course, as well as the documents on the relationship between Palau and Taiwan. And Palau's president, Surangao Whips Jr., publicly blamed China for the cyber intrusion, which was denied. Then in January this year, the US government also uncovered other cyber mercenaries, state-sponsored Chinese hackers that had targeted Guam's critical infrastructure. And it was reported that the Chinese operation was called Volt Typhoon and was meant to disrupt military and civilian operations in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. Now, these developments very much underscore the rise of cyber mercenaries in the region and the role that they will likely increasingly play in any type of geopolitical contestation or that spills over into outright conflict. The privatization of cyber and influence operations very much challenges international law's ability to attribute responsibility, and this facilitates deniable digital warfare. So again, the use of cyber mercenaries as proxies, enablers, and facilitators, in this case, in respect to strategic denial and disruption. The other really defining trend and relating trend in the Indo-Pacific that we see is actually the role of China and the evolving use of private security companies as instruments of influence and presence across the region. And this is the reason why this has become a critical trend is because of the way in which Beijing is using private security to support its strategic goals. And while these companies are nominally distinct from the People's Liberation Army, they do function as key instruments of Beijing's global security initiative, securing particularly assets and infrastructure along the Belt and Road Initiative and mitigating geopolitical risk without overt military conflict. So, for instance, we've seen a significant increase in the deployment of Chinese private security along the China-Myanmar economic corridor and along the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And for instance, the establishment of the joint Sino-Myanmar security enterprise represents a significant qualitative shift in both the scope and ambition of China's private security engagement. And of course, this is taking place in an environment where there is ongoing conflict and human rights abuses. So the trajectory of private security as proxies, enablers, and facilitators becoming all that more acute as geopolitical contestation in the region continues to grow. And of course, though this is just simply at one level, we also have to acknowledge the fact that informal security networks, which are sustaining local economies of protection, mediating access to resources, infrastructure, and communities, while simultaneously embedding external actors within these societies, is also having a significant impact on human rights abuses, on access to justice, and on localized security. And these hybrid security orders are becoming all that more prevalent in countries such as Papua New Guinea, where there are significant parts of the country which are where state governance is increasingly challenged, such as in the highlands, and where we have seen the recruitment of what are locally referred to as mercenaries, but of security actors who are brought in as part of tribal warfare, for example, and that is impacting human rights abuses significantly in these areas, particularly for vulnerable groups, women and children particularly. I'm going to end my comments there, but happy to expand during Q&A. Thank you.
Joanna, we have just a few minutes more. Just wanted first to give Hero present in the room the opportunity to ask the questions, and then I'll call. So is there any question?
Thank you. I'm Renzo Pomi. I work with Amnesty International. And first, I want to express our Amnesty's support for the work, essential work that the special procedures system does, and also express our solidarity with the attacks that the special procedures and other UN experts have been receiving lately, and which has resulted in sanctions or a refusal of granting visas to experts. Well, I have two questions, if possible. One is on the relationship of your mandate with the Security Council and how your reports are received, and if you could share any comments on that, because it seems, of course, that is extremely relevant, the work you do, in particular for the sanctions regimes, the arms embargoes that are imposed in certain countries. At a time when the UN is going through UNIT and review of mandates, it seems to me that more than duplication, what there is underuse of some mandates by the Security Council in particular, with its refusal to engage with human rights experts. The other question is, Jacqueline in particular, mentioned several situations in which private security companies or mercenaries are involved, and two which I don't believe were mentioned was Haiti, although you, Chair Rapporteur, mentioned the use of these companies in crime prevention or suppression. And the other one is in this maybe new trend of addressing humanitarian crisis via initiatives that don't comply with humanitarian principles and may result on further killings by the use of private security companies. So if you could comment on any of those, I would be grateful. And I'm sorry, I didn't say at the beginning how much I appreciate the host for hosting us. Thanks.
The working group is underutilized, as you mentioned, especially in the Security Council perspective. And we were established by the Human Rights Council, and therefore there is this quite clear distinction where we report, which is the third committee, other places. Unfortunately, we noticed that there is a very different language across different UN entities using and usually not referring to mercenaries either for political reasons or others, but we think that using the common language across the board would be very helpful to identify more easily when we are dealing with the same actors. And we are always open to contribute to the other mechanisms and agencies within the UN and actively and proactively seek collaboration with them. Of course, it's not always just up, but thank you for it.
Thank you for the question, Renzo. In terms of Haiti, we've predominantly looked at the conflict through the lens of how gangs are perpetrating atrocities. We haven't fully kind of developed our analysis of the mercenaries and proxy forces dimension, and particularly private military companies. Though I know that there is significant external provision of arms and resources. So hopefully in the future we'll have a better answer for you. But I know that it is something we are looking at in that situation in particular.
public. Christina, can you help us online with?
Yes, Giovanna, we have one question online. I'll read it out, and any participant or any panelist feel free to answer. It's not directed just to one. So in previous years here in the US, an important report was prepared annually by a specialized bureau within the Department of State in keeping with the Elie Wiesel Atrocity Prevention Act. Now that part of this agency has been dissolved, and this year former US government employees generated a shadow report, can other states, particularly in Africa, perhaps step up to fill this gap?
I will maybe leave this to Oliver or Anna.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Anna, I'm sure you've got a much better answer than me. I would just say, yeah, absolutely. The challenges that we currently are facing means that there has to be, these gaps we can't afford these gaps to remain empty. We need to find ways to step forward. I think multilateral action, as much as that may be unfashionable in certain parts of the world, continues to be a fundamental part of this work. So where there's opportunities for states to act unilaterally and be reporting and investigating on that, I think that would be very welcome. But also the opportunities for multilateral action, either through UN mechanisms such as the working group, which is doing fantastic work, but elsewhere, I think we all need to sort of put our shoulder to the grindstone, so to speak, to ensure that these gaps don't remain. Because one thing I will say is that the bad people like gaps, they like spaces in which they can operate where they are not being reviewed, where they're not being investigated. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that those gaps get filled with reporting, investigations, and ongoing work. Thanks.
I would just add here that I think there's a significant opportunity, certainly within this part of the region that I'm in Asia and the Pacific, for the regional groupings such as ASEAN, the Pacific Islands Forum, these regional multilateral groupings to actually step up in the space as well. And to date, there perhaps has been something of a gap here, but this is 100% agree with Oliver in this respect. This is where everyone, including regional multilateral mechanisms, actually need to step in. Thank you for the question and for the report as well. Thank you.
On that report in particular, I'll just highlight that what was unique and special about the Elie Wiesel Act was that it was a mandated annual report that the government sort of had to produce. And so while I welcome every state and government to do something similar, I think that kind of national demand doesn't yet exist. And so they can create the demand, but until it's there, it probably won't happen, fortunately.
Christina, is there another question that we can take?
Those are all the questions we've received online, Giovanna.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much then for everybody online joining us parts of the world. Thank you all in the room for coming this morning. And it was really a pleasure to see some new faces, some well-known faces in the audience, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.